Hello everyone, I'm Koike Yuriko, Governor of Tokyo. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this year's forum. The Pritzker Forum on Global Cities continues to play a key role in promoting collaboration between cities and a variety of stakeholders, facilitating discussions aimed at finding solutions to global challenges. Now, on to this year's theme, Cities and AI. The rapidly advancing AI technology has enormous potential in the area of solving urban challenges. Utilizing data taken from airborne laser scanning of the entire city, Tokyo is working to build a digital twin to recreate the city in cyberspace. Using the digital twin in conjunction with AI to realistically simulate changes in sunlight and wind patterns will, for example, allow us to create comfortable urban spaces. We will also harness the power of AI technology in other areas, such as using it to improve our ability to predict disasters and conduct rescue and recovery operations following a disaster. These efforts will contribute to the realization of a sustainable city. I hope that the frank discussions taking place here will lead to a brighter future for all. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next panel, AI for Local Climate Action. I'm sure you'll all agree, we were just sat there in the green room completely silently, which is not normally what it's like in green rooms. I'll tell you when you're waiting to go on a panel as we watch the other panelists. That was fascinating. And I can expect similar things from our panelists here. I'm Hannah Murphy. I'm a tech correspondent with the Financial Times based out of San Francisco. And here with me, we have Armen Ra Mashriki, Director of Data Strategies at the Bezos Earth Fund. Dr. Mashriki served previously as the Chief Analytics Officer for the City of New York. Jennifer Angel, CEO of Evergreen Canada, a nonprofit working to make cities livable and sustainable. And Anshu Sharma, co-founder of Seeds India, an organization that enables disaster readiness in at-risk communities throughout India and Bangladesh. We're here to talk about how AI has emerged as a powerful tool in this space. It can optimize energy consumption, improve resource management, and enhance the efficiency of renewable energy sources. Its capacity to process vast data sets and provide actionable insights make AI a crucial technology for ensuring that policymakers are delivering on promises to create a more sustainable future. And in this discussion, we're going to take a closer look how it's currently being leveraged to assist in this climate fight. We're going to learn a bit about the lay of the land with a look at some current active projects globally, and then we'll dig into a couple of partnership case studies, the first in Canada, the second in India and Bangladesh. So let us start with a bit of the lay of the land. Armen, can you tell us about what you've been working on? I believe a big survey.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. That's one way to put it. At the Bezos Earth Fund, for those who aren't familiar with the Bezos Earth Fund, it's an impact fund started by Jeff Bezos, and he's taken $10 billion of his dollars and put it into the Bezos Earth Fund. And our task now is we have 8 more years left, but at the beginning we had 10 years to invest $1 billion a year in climate and nature challenges to specifically have an impact in this decisive decade, period, point blank. And so the way we look at investment is around having clear and precise impact. So as the head of the AI initiatives and the head of AI at the Earth Fund, the way I needed to look at this, the question came down from the board, said, look, how is AI going to play a big role here? I had a couple of things that I had to think about. One is we just fund, right? And so I had to think through precision granting. I didn't want to start spraying and praying in terms of making investments and hoping everything works out, especially in an environment like AI, where there is a lot of noise, very little signal, right? A lot of people talking about it and want to do something here. Very few people at this point really being precise. I actually, prior to being at the Bezos Earth Fund, I was the head of urban AI at NVIDIA. At the time when I joined NVIDIA, no one knew about this company. And so I sort of had a front row seat to the growth and the impact of AI over time. And so what we wanted to do was we partnered with Columbia University, Esri, which is a tech company, my old company, NVIDIA, which are both Esri and NVIDIA are private sector companies. They're both partnering pro bono, and University of Albany, who had just gotten $200 million to stand up the AI Institute in New York State. And so we partnered with those four entities to begin to do a full landscape assessment of AI and climate and nature work. The idea was specifically to understand the noise and the signal. Where was impact actually happening? Who was truly using AI for impact? And nowadays we sort of synonymously use, generative AI and ChatGPT. It's just like, Zamboni and, the actual capability, right? Or Pampers, right? We mistake the brand for capability. And so AI crosses a lot of different domains and spaces. And what we needed to do through this landscape assessment was understand who's been doing what and how they've been doing it over time.
How did you collect the data from them? Did they sort of self-report to you, and or what sort of metrics were you looking at?
So a couple of things. To one, desk research, right? Just kind of get out there and understand what's out there. Because a lot of folks who are doing AI are going to put it out there, especially now, where we're in this hype cycle, or people are going to talk more about what they're doing with regards to AI, right? And so one, we did desk research. Two, we had our university at Albany and Columbia University partners push out sort of surveys, engage, interview, go to the top conferences. They not go to the top conferences. These institutions tend to have presences at the top conferences. So we did that from the academic side, right? Which is what they do best. Esri, for those who are familiar with Esri, Esri has a footprint globally in cities, organizations, for-profit, nonprofit organizations in terms of the work that they do. So the idea there was for Esri to tap into literally their internal database of who's doing what and how that work is going over time. So Esri was bringing that in. NVIDIA has a initiative called Inception, which is they create this environment where startup companies and companies that either are using NVIDIA GPUs and DGXs in their supercompute, or NVIDIA would like for them to use their technology. And so NVIDIA sort of creates this Inception, this environment for them to be a part of this, sort of club or organization. So what we did was are engaging with NVIDIA to understand who in that, tens of thousands of list of organizations they're engaging with are actually doing interesting work in climate and nature space. Not all in that space are doing climate and nature. And so those are the four ways that we're sort of bringing in, inclusive of sort of interviews and sort of.
And so what did you learn?
Yeah, not much. I'm joking. That was a joke. Hi, so the report is going to come out in March, and we're going to have a big event. So I don't want to get out in front of my skis on that. But what I will say is nothing terribly shocking. A lot of stuff is in pilot phase, and there are a lot of challenges and funding needs to scale that work. Also, what you also see a separation in terms of globally, where Global South, the Global South is having challenges really just getting in on the ground floor with resources, access to capability, access to AI engineers and data scientists. So you're seeing, what should be no shock to anyone, that distinction between where Global South is having challenges really adopting AI and deploying it and applying it, where other countries and regions have a leg up. The same domestically, right? You see certain communities, environmental justice focused communities having challenges and capacity concerns in terms of deploying AI solutions, where you see other communities. Yesterday the mayor mentioned University of Chicago, but he didn't mention Chicago State, right? And if anyone who's familiar with Chicago knows, there is a complete difference between the academic capability from computer science between those two. And so we saw that across the board, and we see where gaps and opportunities can be in.
I'm going to move to the other panelists in just a second, but I'm curious whether you saw any trends in the types of areas that were being invested in, sort of more in grid management or waste management or predictive XYZ.
Yeah, I think where you're going to see where we saw, if we look at it sort of like a heat map, if you will, that heat map is mostly where we're seeing a lot of work being done across the board, is where you see the most mature technology, which is what's referred to as convolutional neural networks, which is the vision side of AI. Most people talk about ChatGPT, which tends to be the language side of AI. But what that is taking satellite imagery data and using that, using AI, deep learning, some capacity to solve some problem on the ground. Let's say deforestation, or within, how do you track deforestation over time such that you can keep an eye on the bad guys, or also understand what cattle are being raised in deforested lands, right? Or biodiversity, how you track the degradation of a habitat over time with 3-meter resolution satellite imagery. And so where satellite imagery and AI vision come into play, we're seeing a lot of work. We're seeing the sexy, everybody is a ChatGPT version of this, right? Like, it's like ChatGPT has lost its mind and is now infusing into everything. So we're seeing a lot of people wanting to do a ChatGPT version of climate and ChatGPT version of, environmental justice impact and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of noise, no clear signal there, but where the signal that we've seen across the board is where we're using satellite, people are putting up constellations of satellites to really get us some really high resolution, 3-meter impact view on the globe. And I'll also just mention what you're also seeing is NVIDIA had just recently came out with this concept of Earth 2, which is a full digital twin view of the Earth so that you can track and predict climate over time. There's actually 6, 7 other organizations doing that. So that's a space where a lot of stuff is happening.
Perhaps some consolidation in future. We can talk a bit about that. But Jennifer, perhaps you're one of the projects that reported in. I don't know, but tell us a bit about the work you're doing on the ground in this.
Yes. I'm not in climate. When I hear heading is in the business of building better public spaces. So places that are resilient, regenerative, inclusive, because we know they have an outsized impact on how we live and how we move and who gets to participate. So our work is about bringing together private capital and ingenuity together with community capacity and care and commitment at a neighborhood level, with government leadership in order to make better decisions, in order to make better public spaces in our cities that serve more people and contribute to the health of people and also the planet. And so most of our work is hands in the dirt, either directly shaping new public spaces or supporting others at a community level to do that. But recently we've become involved in a new tool called AI for the Resilient City, which is a data analytics and visualization tool that basically allows governments and others to make better decisions at a very granular level, 100-meter by 100-meter plots, about the built environment and the impacts that it directly has on urban heat island effect in cities.
You mentioned using data. What data are you collecting? Are there any more specific projects that you're doing within your remit?
Yeah, so we're using Landsat data, so satellite data, as you referenced, imagery. We're using local heat data. We're using population and demographic data, infrastructure data. So in Canada for 10 years, there's been a real big push to open source a lot of data, municipal and other data. So we're scrubbing all of it. And that's allowing us to both understand what's been happening over the past 10 years, and now with a sort of beta version of our application, predict what will happen when we make particular decisions about infrastructure and make particular interventions in our cities with infrastructure.
And you're doing a specific project in Peel, is that correct?
We are. So the region of Peel is 3 cities. They're among them 2 of the most populated in the country, in Canada. And we've been working with the municipalities there to provide them access to this tool and co-create scenario planning, which allows them to make decisions about resilience planning, about infrastructure planning. So what to build and where, and risk assessments, so that they can better prepare for what may come as a result of their current and future landscape increasingly.
You're mentioning sort of data coming from lots of different places. You're working with lots of different groups. What are sort of some of the challenges you've had to navigate when it comes to these sorts of partnerships? Because they obviously are sort of working solo, you're together.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the obvious ones are the data is not consistent. So there's lots of data out there, but there are gaps in the data for sure. So we've been working with the Standardization Council of Canada, who are working to standardize heat mapping across the country, which will assist in providing us with better inputs to the model. I think it will go without saying, and others on the previous panel shared it. There is an absence of, or maybe it's in its infancy, among civil servants, data capability and experience. I'll say that this program, again, I'm not a data scientist or a tech expert, but I can use it, and that says a lot. So it's a very sort of basic. The back end is no doubt far from basic, but the interface is very basic and easy to use and understand. It's for the first time in some cases where different departments are actually working together. So in one particular order of government, you have planning and GIS and forestry and parks and finance and risk management now working together, infrastructure. In new ways, which we think is exactly what we need to see. So we often say, when we're talking about public spaces, the product, a regenerative and inclusive public space, is really important and can have meaningful impacts. But the process of working together to build it is at least as important as what you build, because it builds trust and resilience, which we require to deal with all of the other problems before us, and is an increasing, at least in a Canadian context, I think it's true here too. Polarization is a real threat. It's another one of the crises before us. And so co-creation in public spaces and also in building out this modeling is itself an important outcome of the work.
I'm seeing nods here on the discussions around sort of education and standardization. But I wanted to ask a bit about this sort of the future planning side of things. You've been working on a tool, scenario mode. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's just out of beta. So it's only beginning to be used. But in short, based on past data over 10 years, it is predictive of the impacts on urban heat island of particular interventions. So for example, you have a green space that is becoming a building of a particular scale, and all else equal, so no additional green space is created. We can predict with I'm told some degree of certainty what will be the impact on urban heat island. So this can be used both to make decisions about land use and the extent of development in a particular space, but also about the importance of protecting green space in cities and the surprising, I would say, to a lot of people, impact that even very small pocket parks, green spaces, can have on urban heat island. And I know there's a book written a number of years ago by social scientist Eric Kleinenberg about the Chicago heat wave, and I'll fumble this a little, but I think it's meaningful. There were devastating effects of heat. Urban heat is a real problem, and it's getting worse, and it's getting more consistent. And there were particular communities, racialized communities, who fared better than others, and disproportionately racialized communities fared worse than everybody else. But there were some communities that fared a bit better, and they are correlated with the presence of high quality public realm proximate to where they live. So people knew their neighbors, and they knew when they weren't there, and so they checked on their neighbors and were able to work as a community. Back to this point about resilience. And so I think parks and public spaces used to be seen as the soft stuff. It's the infrastructure investment you make when there's money left over from building highways. And in my experience, there's never any money left over from building highways. In fact, I think by definition, they just kind of keep going forever. And I think what we're beginning to see, and we're certainly seeing it firsthand, is that even small green public space interventions have an outsized impact on climate and on community resilience. And in particular, in racialized communities in Canada, and I suspect the same is true in the US, these communities are disproportionately underinvested with high quality public realm. And so we think with very little relative investment, we can actually move the needle on that in really meaningful ways. And AI can help make that case.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anshi, can you tell us about your vantage point at Seeds? What's the work you're doing?
So at Seeds, we've been working on disaster response. We rebuild houses and schools and community infrastructure after major disasters. We've been doing it for decades. I myself come from an architecture and town planning background. But the work that we do with AI started with tinkering with our phones. And I'm sure you've all done it. Open the map application. And at least in the early days, we've always, all of us have tried, turning on the satellite view and looking at our own homes and finding it surprising how much clarity is there. You can literally see cars parked around your house. You can see stuff on the rooftop. And what that made us think is that if you can see every rooftop in a community, actually you can see every rooftop in the world, which is about 2 billion homes. They tell you a lot more about what's around them. They tell you a lot about the risk physically to the building, how big they are, how closely packed they are. If it's too dense, really small, then it's a slum. If it doesn't have even 12 to 14 square meters of an area in the footprint, then it doesn't have a toilet inside. We work a lot with poor communities in cities. If there's no green spaces around, if there's water bodies very close by, if there's very steep slopes. So you could read a lot about a building just by looking at its rooftop. The rooftop becomes a proxy, literally like a QR code. And then you can also start reading about the people inside. As I said, if they don't have toilets, do they have bank accounts? Do they have savings? Do they have insurance? And we could start correlating that with the stuff that we find on the ground. And that's what we started doing for training the model. So this is the realization that after having done years of work and on our team having seen hundreds of thousands of collapsed buildings after storms, hurricanes, earthquakes, in instincts, we can figure out which buildings will survive and which not. So there's a kind of a rule set that runs in our heads, and that needed to be broken down, right? So we partnered with Microsoft's AI for Good lab to get this off the ground. We got time from the data scientists there. We built the first base of the model. And then I'm from India. We're somehow very enamored with tech. So we have a lot of local institutions, universities that pitch in for doing stuff. There's amazing cutting edge stuff that happens in some of these very unknown, unsung universities. And that's where we set up a partnership network to figure out how do we start understanding the vulnerability of buildings. And what that does is, I think across the world, when you get a warning for an impending disaster, you get to know about the threat. You get to know about how fast the wind speeds are, how much of rainfall will come, how much of water is going to come gushing down a river. But it doesn't tell you what it's going to do to your home, to your family, to your neighborhood, to your city. And so converting what we call hazard warnings, information about the threat, into impact warnings, what it's going to do to you. And now if you put that layer on top of the understanding you have on every individual building, then you can figure out what an incoming disaster would mean to every single family. And that's the resolution that's achievable with current technology. And I guess somewhere in recent years, the pandemic has already taught us all that the same threat means different things to each one of us. We are vulnerable in very, very different ways to the same threat that we face. And so far, so we're looking at buildings and the built environment, how threatened it is and how every individual building or family would be impacted. But then in the times to come, this can actually go down to individuals and figuring out how risk moves as you as an individual move around. What's about you? What's about your setting in terms of the building, in neighborhood, the city that puts you at risk?
And you're working with city leaders to sort of distribute tools to them?
We are working with city leaders. Governments love dashboards. They take decisions based on that. But there's a lot more. You know what tech today offers is a lot more than that. So as I said, the dream for us has been that if you're sitting here in this room, your risk is made up of a number of variables. One is your own physical condition, your health, your age, your ability to move around. It's constituted of the risk that's there in the building, and then it keeps on expanding, right? And as you move, and it's not a static thing. It changes. It changes every hour. It changes every time you move 2 blocks away. So it's real time stuff. We can't put it on a static dashboard. We can't print it in a report. And there's a lot of data. There's so much of data about every individual, every family that is at risk, and everything that's happening in its environment, built and natural, that's increasing or decreasing the level of risk. We would dream to reach a point where you would be able to pull out your phone and see where your kid is, where your mom is, and who's at what kind of risk. If something goes wrong, you know exactly what to do. You could actually start reducing that risk. So when we work, our challenge has been that over the last 4 years, we've been building this, we've been training the models, we've been testing, we've run it at about 20 odd locations, different kinds of disasters, floods, cyclones, heat waves. But then we are also trying to figure out how to make this, more tactile and useful for the groups that will use it. And governments is one group that will use it. It's right now more for institutional usage, but that's where the current work is happening on how to make it, take it out to people and look at the diverse sets of stakeholders that will actually be able to put this to use.
And I want to put this to the group, as they may have slightly different answers, but how reliable is the tech that you're using? Where are we on the trajectory of getting to where we want to be? I don't know if you're not using generative AI, does hallucinations count or not? Is that important? Armin, from what you're seeing from your kind of vantage point.
Well, sort of generative AI is at its infancy. I think, again, AI writ large encompasses a lot of different types of technologies that have been used consistently and reliably over time, right? I can come up with some, there's a machine learning model called random forest that is a well oft used and relied upon model. I think the question becomes your tolerance level in terms of error, in terms of output that you want, right? I think, which by the way, if you don't take anything from this forum, governments love dashboards is like the best thing. But public sector should have very, very small amount of tolerance for error, if any at all, right? And so I think they shouldn't be using some of these these newer technologies. I think private sector has a larger space to play with in terms of tolerance. So I think these technologies, there's all of these technology readiness indexes you can dig up. We've been finding them in our landscape assessment that tells you where they are and how they're being used, and if they're even really being used in real time. There's tons of universities that we've engaged that are doing stuff that you should not make it out the lab for at least the next year or two because of its inability to really be trusted in a true way in real scenarios. So, I mean, it's just all over the place, but that's a great question. You have to be thoughtful there.
I see you nodding over here.
Yeah. So, yesterday in the opening plenary also, there were discussions around defining AI. And I guess even across this gathering, we have so many views on that. And one way to look at it, the simplest way that I could find is that there's a lot of data that we spoke about, and there are going to be some rules on how you deal with that data, right? So the reliability really depends. The answer lies in the design on how well you've defined the rules, the rule engines that run it. And specifically on the piece that we run, so to let you know that on the heat wave part, we spent 4 years just trying to figure out what happens indoors when there is a heat wave warning in a city. So the temperatures that we always read are outdoor temperatures, ambient outdoor temperatures. The problem that we are facing in our parts, and actually all parts, is in recent years, indoor heat has become an acute problem for those who cannot afford to cool their houses, right? And where I come from, we actually have these contraptions called desert coolers, where in the dry heat months of March and April, we run fans with wet curtains behind them. So they increase the humidity, which is great. But then when you continue to run those in the more humid months, it actually makes matters worse, right? So indoor humidity and indoor heat is an emerging problem that we had not thought about even 5 years ago. And what we've been doing for the last 3 years is we are installing data loggers, very inexpensive devices. Every 15 minutes, we take a recording. We take it for weeks on end. And then we are able to track that if the city is running at a particular temperature, what's happening to people inside, right? And we figured that along the tropics, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, anywhere, any of these areas, if there's a low-income settlement where there are houses, where a typical house is made of 10 walls, any kind of corrugated sheet roofs, the indoors in Celsius, we work in Celsius, it's about 43, 44 degrees Celsius when it's 32 outdoors, right? And when we report heat deaths, we are reporting deaths, the maximum number of deaths on the hottest nights, not the hottest days, because you don't get the respite during the night because of the way you're building your homes and the way you're trapping heat inside them, right? So if the design is clear, if the rules are clear, I think that's where reliability comes from. So the secret sauce is going to be in how you set the rules. With ChatGPT, now we are even talking about AI writing code for you. But even if you're going to instruct a machine to decide the rules, you're still instructing it on what rules the decisions will be made. And that's the secret sauce that I see.
Can I just, I apologize.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing and just be more precise in my statement? Just use an example. If the mayor of Chicago wants to do an outreach program to provide resources to, pre-K resources to low-income communities and does an outreach effort by gathering a bunch of people and volunteers and so on and so forth and does an outreach effort. If you miss 15% of the population, that's an accepted sort of situation. If the mayor of Chicago deploys AI to identify where people are, and you miss one person, and that person steps up and said, because I didn't have access to that resource, my life has degraded by this much, that mayor's in trouble. And that's the challenge that AI, and I've seen it in my time in New York City, and I've seen it over and over again working with cities. That's the biggest challenge. So regardless of how robust the technology is, how it's used and who it impacts, and then the way it impacts them is always going to be at play, specifically in public sector in cities.
Yeah, I'm probably the least qualified to answer that question, but I would share this, like, even if it was absolutely perfect, because, and I think it certainly goes a long way to helping us see things we may not otherwise see, that doesn't mean people will act on it. And so what we're interested in particular is how to leverage the clarity and granularity that this tool is able to provide, so that instead of sort of this climate problem being a very high level arm waving type of situation, people are armed with information, even if not entirely perfect, that makes real the decisions that we're making about land use. And that provides support for political courage to do things a little bit differently. So it may not be entirely perfect. Our AI model is not intended to replace, for example, climate modeling in a particular area, but it is directional and it is meaningful. And our hope is that it's practical and granular enough to be a powerful aid, not only in evidence-based decision-making, but actually the courage to implement because it's real for people.
And I wanted to pick up on something you said related on the sort of standardization piece. How should we think about standardizing sharing models across sectors, between organizations, public, private, particularly if there's sort of competition in the space and also privacy concerns?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I think, so we're a not-for-profit, and I spent 15 years working in government in what we call a crown corporation in Canada, which is we had a responsibility for public land stewardship, but worked very closely with private sector developers to steward the land and community. And I think I would share that what's interesting to me about where I work now is that we are driven to the best outcome. So in government, I think there is always, of course, a desire to do right by the people who elect you and the place that you steward. But there's also this vote thing that sometimes gets in the way of good decision making. And the private sector, likewise, there's a lot of emergent ESG programs, corporate social responsibility, and there's a lot of big private investment in really meaningful social and environmental programs. But there is often this profit imperative that can get in the way. We're just in it to do the right thing, like quite literally. Like that's what and our hope is that by cutting through some of that, we are building some trust. Like we are uniquely positioned to engage community in a way that government can't. I know it. I was there hosting community meetings, and you start from a trust deficit. Private sector is the same. It's hard to engage community in a private sector project and have community believe that you're in it for their interest. We're able to convene and aggregate capital and interests from this not-for-profit space that I think is very, very powerful. And so in general, I think the scale and complexity of the issues before us, climate among them, require all hands on deck. And I think the last panel talked about sort of distributed leadership a little bit. I deeply believe that community-led, small-scale projects, a blizzard of them across the country or across the world, is the answer, because no government knows how to do it by themselves. Private sector need others too. So bringing those resources and unique resources together is the answer. And this is one touchstone for doing that, I think.
I have to ask, because I'm with the Financial Times, but what about the cost? How expensive is it to fund these sorts of projects? How sustainable in the long term? I don't know if you have an overview did you look at costs when you were doing your survey and how much people were spending?
I know how much people are asking for.
How much are people asking for?
How to answer that question? I think that having come from the technology space, I have my PhD in computer science, and I've been in private sector in this space for a very long time. I think when I started in private sector, I used to work at a company that none of you probably remember. It's called Motorola, based in Schaumburg, Illinois. And I used to work in Schaumburg for years. And back then we had a partnership with University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a lot of the smart work came out of University of Illinois and then got deployed and then hit the ground in terms of innovations. So there was a pipeline. So there was a shared cost across that pipeline. We would hire at Motorola from U of I and so on and so forth. And there was a shared cost. What you're starting to see is that pipeline got broken down. And so universities are trying to do not only the R&D and the training and the teaching, but also the deployment and the development. So I get a lot of calls from universities literally saying, fund us to not only build this, but to teach it and then to deploy it on the ground, as opposed to sort of a pipeline and a partnership. So there is more cost there because you're engaging with one entity. So I think to your point, there has to be an ecosystem from the ground up to understand that shared cost. But the numbers that I see, $10 billion is just not going to be enough. The government is going to have to jump in and make some big investments here, both local and federal and private sectors. Been diving in, but that's going to have to get shared across as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. But the question also depends on what is it that we're trying to achieve, the cost of what, right? And I think what gives me hope is that with the stuff that we are able to do, and as I said, we are taking it to governments now. Municipalities, a little difficult because the scale is very small. But in South Asia, when we are speaking to state governments, we are very often hearing, okay, at this costing, money is not the problem. Tell us how it will work. Tell us what the other risks are. Tell us about data privacy risks and stuff like that. So we can break it down. And what that's done to us is that we started as a philanthropy piece, exactly like you work. And when we are now speaking and we're getting requests from governments to scale at that level, we're caught in a bit of a fix that now it has to turn into a model that can be scaled. It can't run on philanthropies. And that's where the question that's coming to us is, okay, so we bring it down to a square kilometerage kind of a pricing, which then would depend on how many layers, what kind of risks, what actions do you want to drive on that. Just knowing the risk is not good enough, what plans you will make on it. But I think state governments being able to think that they can afford tech like this is a great indicator that we are getting somewhere where it will start creating impact.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is we're talking about what does it look like if this is free? So how do we make even a basic model that's free and can be used internationally to help predict or influence planning decisions for better heat island outcomes? But equally, I would say, again, on sort of the other side of things, the cost of not investing in this type of technology is enormous. And the downstream effects of climate change, talk to the insurance industry or any government dealing with it, and it's those are numbers that are too big to even imagine, I think. And so, they're big numbers. I think to your point, I don't know how big they are. Aggregating resources and capacity is one way to make it a little easier.
I'm going to go out to the audience in a second for questions. So do think of your questions and put up your hand shortly. But I just wanted to ask one thing, which is about the environmental impact of AI itself and whether you're thinking about that. It's obviously, it involves a lot of computational power to train the models, sustain the models. It's very resource intensive. How can you ensure that the ecological benefit outweighs this negative impact? Are you thinking about this as you develop projects? Are you seeing people thinking about this?
Yeah, people are thinking about it. We're thinking about it. The market sort of is going to play a role in this. What you're seeing now is if the analogy here is the gold rush, what you're seeing now, or remember in the gold rush, it was really the infrastructure companies that kind of, Wells Fargo, Levi's and Strauss, Picks and Axe companies made all of the money. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the infrastructure companies, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all of these big infrastructure companies sort of growing and expanding. ChatGPT, there's a story, I'm going to get this messed up, but Google it. The ChatGPT, to train the model for ChatGPT, because they have to water cool the servers that they got from NVIDIA in Iowa, almost caused some sort of drought in terms of access to water in Iowa, right? And so you see these infrastructure companies having an impact on the environment in a way that we haven't seen before. Now that's scaling up. But what we're starting to see is that's the infrastructure companies. The entities that are actually using this won't have as big a footprint in terms of, they don't need supercomputers to actually access the trained models. They actually, what you're going to start to see are the Intels and the Qualcomms and the AMDs of the world who have the CPUs starting to ramp up because all you need is really a strong CPU to access that. So there's going to be some leveling out. Like the infrastructure companies don't grow infinitely. It's the users that do have the capacity to grow infinitely. I would be concerned if the infrastructure companies, if it was just like supercomputers on top of supercomputers on top of supercomputers. But we do see where the market will may correct in that space. I do think that we have to start looking at solutions that don't require, so University of Florida, to give them a shout out, are working on a project where they're actually just using one GPU to build a sort of a supercomputer enabled capability, right? And so what you're starting to see at the academic level of researchers sort of saying, do we need a sledgehammer for these ants? We actually don't. But what do we need? And starting to pare down. So you're going to see that over time.
Have you had to wrestle with these issues?
Yeah. So this is part of the package on the ethical side, and the discussions are happening as we are talking about this. The one thing that does come to mind is, besides the fact that there's an investment being made when you're training the model, and then usage is a different thing, also that you're using in different geographic locations. So unlike traditional industries and looking at EIAs for those, the environmental impacts here will be taking place in other places, other locations, far away from where you're actually using the tech. So an important question we don't have, I've not seen any answers so far.
Yeah, all of what they've said, and make sure that we're applying it in spaces that have a big return on those resource investments. So as I said, like, is there an opportunity to open source some of technology so we're not duplicating efforts and therefore redundant use of resources? And when we have good information that allows us to make better, in our case, infrastructure decisions, let's use it and actually have the courage to make those decisions.
Jennifer, do we have any questions out there? If people can raise their hands now. There's someone over here.
I had a question about the horse to water problem. So I'm curious if any of you have any specific experience about how, like, municipal, regional, state, provincial governments respond to the information that is, or the predictions that are generated by the solutions that you've described. Because we know that evidence-based decision making is like, everybody talks about it and lots of governments don't do it. So I was wondering if there's any, any conclusions that you can draw about that.
I'm happy to start. I think the answer is, and I think it's the subtext of your question, like, it often doesn't happen. And it is, it's one thing to have the tech that does the thing. It's another thing to convince people to take that insight and actually do something meaningful with it. And so, for example, in my hometown of Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada, we're using the cover of the housing crisis to justify building housing in marshlands. And so, like, I think importantly, simplicity or elegant simplicity in the presentation of this data is important to move people, civil society, politicians, leadership, others. Like, understanding matters. Simplicity in public communications matters. And maybe if enough people understand what we're talking about and can see the evidence and see it's compelling, there might be pressure to make the hard decisions. But it is a very real issue, and it's a good question that I think about a lot.
If I can answer that in this way, two things. One is, if you look, and I paid attention a lot because I just left New York City government. During COVID, everyone was talking about, follow the data, right? But when our mayors and our governors were standing up, having their daily briefings, there was not one chief data officer from their state or that municipality that was next to them during those briefings. So then you had to ask, well, what role is the chief data officer if it's not to ensure that the mayor or the governor has all of the data and the best data that they need with which they're making decisions? So that's one. Two is anecdotally, because I think that's an interesting question. From my time in New York City, you mentioned I was the chief analytics officer for New York City. From my time, there was a scenario in which my team worked on tenant harassment problems. So we use data to identify bad landlords who were illegally harassing tenants. We found a bunch of bad guys. The mayor decided to do a press conference, and the Department of Buildings and the Housing Preservation and Development Commissioner and all of the fancy commissioners were on the dais, were invited to be on the dais. And my team said, well, why aren't we? Because we were the data team behind this predictive work. Why wasn't the director of the mayor's office of data analytics invited to be on the dais? And I said, well, just leave it alone. But my chief of staff said, no, I'm going to make a thing. I'm out of it. So he called the mayor's chief of staff, said, well, why isn't the head of MODA on the stage? He said, because if the mayor stands up and says, we use data and analytics to predict and identify the bad people in this, there is a whole host of questions that we don't know how to answer that will come from press and the audience. And then there's this interesting YouTube where the mayor of, not the current, but the previous mayor of Baltimore was talking about predictive policing. And someone in the audience said, is that like a Minority Report? And then the police chief that was standing next to the mayor said, no, because we're making the algorithms available to the public. Like, what public? East and West Baltimore? That's who you're making it available to? Like, they're going to be digging through your algorithms? So it has been challenging for mayors to really answer the questions that come from, hey, we're using AI to predict blah, blah, blah. And I haven't seen that problem get solved yet. So I would be shocked if you're going to have a mayor stand up and say, we've had this intractable challenge for the last 5-10 years, and we solved it with predictive AI. Because I just don't think that they've created enough space to begin to answer all of the questions around ethics and bias and all of those things, at least just yet.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other thing. We were in Barcelona last week at the Smart Cities Conference, and someone told a story about, I think it was called Curious Nose. I think it was in, I'll get this all wrong, but it was somewhere in, I think maybe Belgium or something. Maybe not Belgium. But so it was this initiative to deploy sensors across neighborhoods to test air quality. And they did that, and there was huge uptake. And it turned out that what the politicians were reporting as the state of clean air was actually not consistent with what residents discovered. It was much, much worse than what the politicians were sharing. And I understand that it changed election outcomes. So sometimes the truth is not politically expedient. And that matters for decision making.
Any further questions? If you line up behind here, we've got a couple more. We are now officially eating into your break time, but I think we should do a few more quick fire questions if we can. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Carolina. I'm Argentinian. So I'm looking at these conversations and panels from the perspective of Global South. And I really appreciated the mention of sort of, Global South perspectives in this specific panel. So what I'm thinking, from a sort of Global South perspective is, we are going to be big players in combating the climate crisis. We are also going to take the brunt for the climate crisis in our cities, in our countries, in our region. And I guess the question I had for the panel is, I do worry. First of all, I want to say there's a lot of wonderful innovation happening across the Global South, and I think the City Initiative illustrated that really well. And I do worry when we discuss some of these issues that sort of South will end up being sort of a technology taker, a solution taker, as we develop these, AI solutions for fighting the climate crisis. So the question to the panel is, how do we better integrate and empower the Global South? How we better acknowledge the innovation that's going there already?
Anyone want to take that?
I have some thoughts.
Sure.
I think thank you for that. And I think one of the things to what you said is that a lot of the solutions in the Global South aren't starting from top down in terms of let's identify an interesting technology and see if we can deploy it. A lot of the solutions that we're seeing in a lot of regions in the global south are starting from people on the ground. People on the ground using the means that they have and the capabilities that they already have to really solve some of these tough problems. And I think engaging there and understanding there and bringing that to the fore, starting from that point, not starting from technology, not starting from AI, but starting from what has been the biggest challenges and what are the solutions that are being brought to bear by the people in those communities. I'll also tie that into a lot of our environmental justice communities here in the United States. You cannot provide, there is a great saying that they have is nothing for us without us, right? And that goes to the for the global south, which is you have to acknowledge that there are people who have been suffering in these spaces for a long time around climate and environmental issues, but have also been offering solutions by hook or crook, by any means. And you have to respect that and bring that to the table as to provide additional sort of innovative solutions. It is relatively non-trivial, but I think from the Bezos Earth Fund perspective, there's funding that tends to be a gap that we tend to look to fill. But I think there's other gaps that would need to be filled in.
Thank you. We have one more question over there.
Morning. Very briefly, continuing from the idea of the global south, I've been thinking about this since this came up earlier in the panel, but I think it is interesting to note, right, that we're currently, in addition to the global south having capacity problems, being able to apply this technology, we also have this interesting dynamic where apparently American foreign policy is that the export of the technology to do AI is a military concern, a competitive concern. So in addition to the South not being able to access this, we also have large parts of Asia that are ineligible to even receive this product. From your work, obviously the foreign policy conversations down the hall, but from your work, thanks for laughing. Is this a threat? Is it going to be normal where everyone sends their data to AI to America? We do all the AI here, we send it back. Is it going to be like the COVID vaccine where, the Chinese are 80% effective and so on based on homegrown sophistication? Or is it just that a lot of these innovations are going to be limited to the West because of these geopolitical forces we can't control? Thank you.
Who would like to take that first? Anshi?
So, somewhere in the title of this conversation, AI for local climate, AI and climate are going to be great equalizers globally in good and bad ways. And a lot of this is you just can't hold the tech back. It's coming up like amazing. It's mushrooming everywhere. As I said, we started off with very high-end conversations with global data science leaders, and right now what's happening in India is local universities with their laptops, not even supercomputers, they're dishing out amazing stuff. So I think a lot is going to happen. A lot is going to happen very democratically, whether we like it, whether we design for it or not. And I do see the other thing that I do see, again, back to the mayor. I think the mayor did a great job with his speech yesterday. He's the most quoted person of the forum, I guess. But the mayor spoke about how the tech part is a tool, but he looks at people because he said, we live in the neighborhoods, right? So living in the neighborhoods and solutions emerging from what people are facing and people are doing on their own is something that has happened fairly well in the global south in the last 2 or 3 decades. In fact, I did my PhD from Japan under a supervisor who was a senior Japanese professor who had bumped into in Western India. We were working on the ground after an earthquake, and he was leading a delegation looking at how communities respond without waiting for external aid to arrive. So if there's a major disaster in the global south, we're not waiting for the emergency agencies to come. We know probably they will not come for a number of days. So what's the response that kicks in? There is, if you start studying that, there are enough indicators to inform even AI models on how decisions are taken that are not top-down decisions. So, a lot of notions are going to get flipped. The answers are not going to be on traditional lines as we unravel things in the coming years, and it's going to happen fairly fast is what I believe.
Just to quickly add to that, thank you for that question, for all the questions. So a couple of things. One is you're referring loosely to when Department of Commerce disallowed NVIDIA to sell certain AI chips to Asia. And then what NVIDIA did was then modified those chips that didn't fit under this, federal government sort of regulatory requirement, modified the chips and sold those. And then, as regulatory regimes tend to be, is always behind the tech, then had to modify their regulation for those chips. And then AI NVIDIA just Freudian slip there. NVIDIA just came out with another chip and is now continuing to engage. So one, the market will play its role. I think the other thing is, if you look at the AI, I spent way too much time digging through the executive order, the AI regulation order that came out of the federal government. There's a whole section in it that literally says, to your point, I don't know where the questioner is, but to your point, foreign individuals must be monitored in how they're using cloud compute for training models. So literally Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and others have to figure out a way, it's suggested, but have to be in compliance with this regulatory framework, have to figure out a way to understand who's accessing their machines to train models and then report that, right? And so to your point, and regulatory frameworks tend to do this, which will have a negative impact on the global South users, more so because everyone else is going to figure out a way around that, right? And so we haven't been thoughtful about that in any real way. It's just been haphazard how we've been responding to that problem. But we have to figure out some way to think that through.
Thank you. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble if I don't wrap this up now. So I think you'd all like to join me giving a big round of applause for our excellent panelists. Yeah. But worthwhile. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be hosted by the Chicago Council for this talk on soft power and AI. I am keenly aware that I stand between you and the coffee break, so I promise to be crisp. For those who can't wait, we have some coffee back there. Now, over the past 2 decades, we've witnessed the convergence of 3 big trends: a profound loss of trust in the federal government's ability to do its job and make the right decisions. And as we heard in the previous panel, there have been an exciting, rapidly growing movement towards achieving public goals through behavioral interventions at the city level, what we call soft power. And then we have the tsunami that comes through artificial intelligence. And it is empowering us in some domains, efficient management in terms of transportation, as we've heard, but also disempowering in other ways with fake news and deep fakes. The prospect of AGI, meanwhile, has become like an alien in a movie. Some people say it's out there and it'll attack before we know it, and then others say it's already here. The call is coming from inside the house. There's a wide array of opinions in between, and there's a lot of hand-wringing. And I want to suggest to you that we already have some very good intuitions, technology, policy, and ethical intuitions about how the intersection of these trends will go. First, by any measure, we are likely to have a weak regime of global regulation. Companies and nations alike say they want to compete and win, and in the very same breath, they say they want to contain artificial intelligence. You can never have it both in full, and those incentives are working against each other. It's hard to win the race if someone else is keeping you at the starter's block. Regulators, it's safe to say, will be outgunned in their technical capacity to assess what is disclosed and will be underfunded in terms of personnel and equipment. We have seen this play out time and time again in the financial sector with banking and hedge fund crises. Industry knew what was happening while the regulators did not. Now, smaller offshore countries will continue to have an incentive to be weak links in global regulation regimes and to market themselves as such. If tech companies are willing to go to Ireland for tax rates, it's not realistic to expect them to stay in the US for LLMs. Now, my second intuition is that cities will be playing a profound role in redefining civic trust at this intersection, the intersection of AI and behavioral interventions. Why? Because at the city level, Issues stop being abstractions. We all know people begin to see and experience tangible benefits in their lives. Now, Axon Enterprises, for example, is a company that popularized the taser, which has been a big step forward in non-lethal interventions. Good. That saved lives. In the last year, though, Axon's ethics board resigned because the company decided to move ahead with its next phase, which is to put remotely activated tasers on drones for use in mass shooter situations. Well, diplomatically speaking, that's interesting. Tasers on drones using AI cameras. One thing we have learned is that facial recognition programs are much more likely to misidentify people of color at higher rates. So what would the net effect have been? Axon was considering putting an AI technology into the field that would decrease the deterrence of lethal force facing shooters, but increase the likelihood that an innocent person of color would be harmed. Exciting technology, not so exciting ethics. When it comes down to lives saved or lives lost, those prospects sharpen the mind. In this case, people on the technology side of the question and the people on the ethics side seem to be talking past each other. By the way, I am not picking on Axon. I just think it's a fascinating case. Time after time, bike sharing programs in New York City, smart thermostats, retirement savings programs, when we put AI technology with a strong behavioral element in the field, we learn a lot very quickly. The good news is that people, both the designers and participants, can develop a new language for civic participation. Simple passwords, for example, were a very effective norm for decades. People learned why and how to use them. Now we have two-factor authentication. People are learning. Next, we will move into an era of biometrics and passkeys. People will learn. It is not too much to say that the language of AI will be the language of inclusion, language of empowerment, and the language of privacy. And we need to become fluent ourselves so our children and grandchildren can become fluent. Now, my third intuition is this: the United States has always regarded itself as a great laboratory of democracy. That continues to be true, and we should feel very proud to be part of that bold experiment. People travel from all over the world to participate in our democratic experiment, but we are also entering a new era with artificial intelligence and behavioral interventions. Let's call it a friendly AI plus BI. When the number of scale of public policy outside the US will dwarf what is happening inside the US. So just look at the agenda here today and the participants. We have Italy, India, Singapore. While the US is large, prosperous, and resilient, these are countries that have much more incentives to experiment and adopt soft power interventions for governance than America does. They're moving at a very high speed, and it's easy to see why. The urgency around climate change is increasing day by day. Robotics and bioengineering have bigger laboratories in these destinations. The scale of some of these interventions, such as China's social credit system, are fascinating. Now, if this is concerning, it doesn't have to end badly. As an optimist, I would offer that a scenario could be win-win if we approach it the right way. We are seeing more robust experimentation at the city and state level. In fact, a devolution of power that may be attractive to conservatives and thus making it bipartisan. Also see a revitalization of data-driven mindsets and ambitious public policy goals, which are hallmarks of liberal tradition. Now, these forces can combine in very powerful ways. I saw this happen in New York City when I was the Commissioner for International Affairs. We were able to champion the Sustainable Development Goals and dialogue about the SDGs primed stakeholders to be more open to tangible changes when they were translated from policy into practice. It provided a different and important frame of reference. This is slow, retail level work, but it makes much more sense to change mindsets first, rather than introduce complex solutions through advanced technology and hope that people will catch up. We have so much to learn, and we're looking through two lenses, AI and BI. And I'll leave you with this simple example, right on red, the right on red option at intersections. This is something that I, in fact, all know very, very well, because New York is one of the few places where you don't have a right on red. Right on red was expanded by states in the 1970s to reduce gas consumption. Since then, AI traffic light systems have been introduced to speed up traffic flow. And we've introduced bike sharing programs, which means we have more bikers trying to get through these intersections. So which is better for climate change? Less idling by cars or safer biking lanes? It turns out that pedestrian deaths in the US are now at a 40-year high. One of the significant factors cited is right on red. So we have two behavioral norms, both good for society, that are literally colliding. Mayor Johnson, right here in Chicago, has put down a marker indicating that right on red may be cut back, and we'll have to see what happens. How much behavior can you change? How strong is soft power? How much behavior should you change? When should it be used, and at what scale? These are the types of questions I love and that are taking place all over the world, and that will be the basis for my forthcoming book. And this is a fascinating intersection of policy domains, and I look forward to meeting with you more to discuss them. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the break.